Hey, we're going to be painting a still life of two cherries in this video today. We'll start out with a sketch, basically drawing with two circles. This subject matter has a reflective quality on the surface. We have some water drops on it. We'll be using the three stages of watercolor: color blocking, contrast and saturation, and structure and detail to get this piece to the final end result. So you can sketch your piece as tight or as loose as you want, as much as you need at this point. So working through getting that sketch put together, dropping in all the information I think I'm going to need to paint this. And remember, at any point along the way, if you mess something up, you can always fix it. So we have the sketching done, and then we're going to get started on stage one with the color blocking. And I'm going to be using a pretty limited color palette: red, purple, green, maybe a smidge of burnt umber. I'm going to be using a mop brush and applying the base color wet on dry over the entire surface of the cherry, not worrying about the highlights or anything. Getting a nice saturated color on there. This is probably a coffee state. And now I'm switching over to wet on dry in the background, very thin mixture of red, and letting that wet on dry also interact with the wet shape of the cherries for a little wet on wet color interaction between the foreground of the objects and the background faint color. And now I'm switching brushes to a flat, and I'm lifting highlights off of that damp surface of the cherries, just picking around, lifting the pigment and finding the highlights. I'm making the marks in the direction of the surface of the cherries to give that illusion of depth and form on the surface. There's some complex shapes on the top of that cherry where the highlights are interacting with the indents, the form, and it's a very soft circular motion that I'm trying to capture. I'm popping in the reflected highlight on the underneath side of the cherry. Just picking around, looking for everything that I want to drop in. All these things will help me create form. And that surface is drying, and it will dry lighter. But it's still damp enough. It still lifts very nicely, so I can soften edges and create a transition, a feather. I'm testing the surface. It seems to be dry enough now, and we're moving into stage two. And we're going to start adding and looking for bigger shapes, more saturated color, and creating some contrast. We have a base pinkish color, and now we're dropping in some really intense reds, mixing a little bit more purple into the mix. Get a darker red, a richer red. And this is now wet on dry, and I'm coming back in with a wet brush and just softening those edges, feathering them out, creating transitions. Do that on both cherries, same colors, same palette. I really don't have any other colors in this piece to throw into it to influence the colors on the surface. This is really kind of a reflection on the surface of the cherry that I'm I'm working on, that upper being darker than the lower. It's like the edge of a tabletop you're seeing reflected in the surface of the cherry. And again, this video is sped up about 3 times normal. You get a little more color complexity, a little more color contrast from one end to the other in that transition. Alright, I'm going to go after the stems here. So a little bit of that grass green, mix in with a little bit of burnt umber. At least I have a puddle there waiting. I'm using that number 2 Cosmo Top brush. Nice thin brush, nice points on those, especially when they're brand new. Testing the surface, see if it's dry enough. Mixing up a very red-violet color, a little more contrast. Really coming after the contrast and some structure here. This is wet on dry. That paint stays where I put it unless I come in and feather it just like that. And again, if a student makes any kind of a mistake at this point, it might be not letting that surface dry enough so that when they do want to paint detail and structure, that paper's got to be dry enough to hold that paint where you put it. Otherwise, that paint moves. Alright, so now I'm glazing in more saturated red onto that lower portion of the cherry just for saturation. So it's not quite as cool. That top portion of the cherries has a lot of violet in it, and the lower portion doesn't have as much. Even though I'm adding a little more of the cherry glaze up on the top area just to create a little more evenness, especially on that right cherry. There isn't that distinct a separation as on the left cherry. And again, picking, lifting, working on the water droplets. I'm softening edges on the highlights. Yeah, just softening them up, even the edges. And don't be afraid to let some of your marks show. Typically, when you're working wet on wet, you're after a nice smooth transition and you don't necessarily want to see individual brush strokes. But if you're working wet on dry, adding detail, all of those little marks and spots, and they add character to the illusion, more so than what a photograph can capture. Yeah, and I'm really adding some contrast into that shadow where the front left cherry is in front of the second cherry on the right, getting that contrast to start creating a little more sense of depth and form. And now I'm back to adding that really dense, dark reddish purple, adding that contrast into the cherries. Now I'm going after the stems, the shadow side of the stem, working in that dark green, putting some of that purple up into green or some of that burnt umber, getting that dark, lovely dark green on the shadow side. Working with a number 1 brush right now, number 1 round. Just bouncing around, doing irregular shapes, painting with a line essentially right up there on that edge. It's drying, and as it's drying, I'm working on the cherry now again. A little more contrast, finding details. And now I'm just adding a bit of phthalo blue as a contrast out into the negative space. It's a very thin wash. It's just going to be a suggestion of color. And we're now definitely deep into stage 3. And now I'll bounce around and look for details. And really working with highlights and contrast and lines to really start making the piece pop. And on the stem, I'm dropping in a mid-tone green, making textural marks, cross contour to kind of go around the barrel of the stem. And I'm dropping in more contrast, starting to work on the water drops. I can still see the underdrawing, and I know where those drops are, and I'll start defining them. I'll be putting some contrast against highlights to make the whites appear brighter. And dropping in, that was a little dry brush right there on that reflected edge, that nice dark purple. Finding the edges of the cherries with that number 1 brush, that number 1 round, intensifying the shadows. There it is, dropping that contrasting color right against the highlights. Okay, now I'm coming back in with just water, and I'm lifting out the highlights wherever those water droplets are. Defining the highlights that I can see in the photograph. This technique works great when you have a nice dense color to lift from, so you can see that one water droplet in that dark purple really pops, softening the edges on the one that's on the edge of the cherry. Turn around, finding the shape, lifting it out, bringing up the lightness, the value of that hue. Softening out a little bit of that highlight. And now, definitely the last things I ever do with the piece is bounce around, add those highlights, those little specks of light catching an edge, a highlight, the water droplets. This is really where the water droplets will start to pop. And now that I had put that soft blue in the highlights that I had picked out, it gives it a nice base for that little spot of white that I'm dropping in, that opaque pro white. Yep, now I'm defining those water droplets. And there it is, our final piece. A couple of nice wet cherries, simple color palette, starting from a couple of circles. We have reflections, we have water droplets. This is definitely a subject matter that any beginner can tackle and practice and get good at. So, give me a like, hit the subscribe button, and I'll see you in the next video.